There is a paragraph somewhere that you have tried to read 3 times. You know the one. It's not a bad paragraph, it's a good paragraph, and it's from something you actually want to read. Something you've chosen, and yet somewhere inside the second or the third sentence, without deciding to, without noticing the exact moment it happened, your attention slid. Not to anything in particular, just away, and you went back to the top of the paragraph and started again. And the same thing happened. And by the third time, there's a specific low frustration that is difficult to name, but it's immediately recognizable. The frustration of a mind that cannot quite hold on to the thing that it's pointing at. And this isn't about intelligence, and it's not about the difficulty of the material. It's about something that has quietly changed in the texture of how the mind works. Something that most people notice, they mention it briefly, and they attribute it vaguely to getting older, or being busy, or having a lot on, and then it gets set aside. Because what else do you do with it? I want to suggest that setting it aside is the wrong move. That the thing you noticed, the sliding, the inability to hold, is not a minor inconvenience, but a significant symptom. And that understanding what it's a symptom of is the beginning of doing anything useful about it. The previous video made the case that the attention economy was built deliberately, that its machinery runs on specific psychological vulnerabilities, and that the cost it imposes on mental health, on cognition, on democracy are real and largely unaccounted. If you haven't watched that video, it provides the foundation for what follows. But this video is not about the system. It's about what the system has done to the inside of a mind, to your mind possibly, and about what recovery, if that's even the right word, actually looks like. She deleted the apps on a Sunday evening in January. Not all of them, the practical ones stayed, but the feeds, the ones she checks without deciding to, the ones that were somehow always open even when she didn't remember opening them, those all went. She moved the browser to the back of a folder, so it required 3 taps to reach. She turned off all notifications except calls and texts, and she told 2 people she was doing it, which felt important for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, accountability maybe, or just the need to make the decision feel real by saying it out loud. The first 3 days were stranger than she expected. Not harder, stranger. There was a restlessness that didn't have anywhere to go. Sometimes a hand moving towards the pocket and finding nothing worth picking up. Moments of waiting for the kettle, for the bus, in the queue at the supermarket. They felt longer than they used to. They weren't unpleasant, they just unoccupied in a way that felt unfamiliar. By the end of the first week, something had shifted slightly. The restlessness had settled. She read for longer than she had in months, and she noticed that conversations felt different, that she was more present in them, less aware of the phone's existence as a competing claim on attention. She slept better. She would not have said she felt dramatically different, but she would have said she felt more like herself in a way she couldn't fully articulate, but she recognised. On day 11, she was on a train, on a long journey, and she just finished the book she brought. So she was bored, genuinely, simply bored, in the way that you can be on long journeys with nothing to do. So she reinstalled the app, not because something urgent had happened, not because she needed it, because she was bored. And This boredom was uncomfortable, and the app was the obvious solution to the boredom. And the friction that she'd put into place was not quite enough to stop her in the moment when the discomfort was present. What happened next is the part of this story that matters most. She opened the feed and she scrolled for a few minutes, and it felt nothing particular. Not relief, not satisfaction, just a mild familiar stimulation, and then the faint sense that she was back somewhere she'd been trying to leave. And she noticed something that she'd not expected. The boredom on the train, before she reinstalled the app, had been preferable to this, quieter, more hers. But she kept the app anyway. This isn't a story about failure, it's a story about the precise nature of the problem. A problem that willpower alone is not adequate to solve. And it's worth understanding clearly before we talk about what might actually help. The attention researcher Gloria Mark spent years studying what happens to knowledge workers in the actual texture of their working day. Not what they reported, but what she observed, directly by following them around with a clipboard and timing things. What she found was this: the average knowledge worker in a normal working environment sustains uninterrupted focus for an average of about 3 minutes before something interrupts them. A notification, a colleague, an impulse to check something. 3 minutes. And after each interruption, after the focus is broken and the person returns to the task, it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully regain the depth of concentration that was present before. Not to resume the task, to fully return to the depth of focus. The maths here is punishing. If you are interrupted every 3 minutes and full recovery takes 23 minutes, then full recovery never happens. You are not doing deep work interspersed with interruptions. You are doing something else. A shallower, more fragmented mode of engagement that feels like working, but it isn't quite. The outputs are produced, the hours pass, but the quality of attention brought to the work is categorically different from what sustained, uninterrupted focus makes possible. This is the cognitive cost that does not appear in any of the attention economy's accounting. It's not dramatic, it does not look like damage, it looks like a slightly distracted person getting through their day. But the capacity for sustained, focused thought is not a trivial thing. It's the foundation of genuine intellectual development, the thing that makes it possible to hold a complex argument in mind long enough to evaluate it, to sit with a difficult problem long enough for something non-obvious to emerge, to read a book with enough attention to let it actually change how you think. These are not specialised skills for academics and professionals. They are the basic equipment for living. And for a significant portion of the population, particularly those who've grown up with smartphones, there is considerable evidence that this equipment has been quietly degraded by the very environment in which it was supposed to develop. The paragraph you couldn't finish is not a small thing. It is a data point about what has happened to the inside of a mind that has been chronically interrupted. There is a harder cost that is more difficult to name, and it goes deeper than the capacity to focus. Consider what it means to develop a sense of yourself, a working understanding of who you are, what you value, what kind of person you are or are trying to be, primarily through the feedback a social media platform provides. The self-concept that forms in that environment is calibrated to a very specific kind of mirror, a mirror that tells you in real time which version of yourself gets approved and which version gets ignored, which thoughts are worth having publicly as measured by the response they generate, which emotions are legible and rewardable, and which are too complicated or too quiet to play well in the feed. The platform is not a neutral mirror. It is a mirror with a very particular set of preferences built into it. Preferences for what is emotionally activating, for what is shareable, for what generates a response. And the self that forms in front of that mirror is shaped by those preferences, often without the person being aware that the shaping is happening. Sherry Turkle, who has spent decades studying how people relate to digital technology, describes what she calls the always-on anxiety. It's the state of being never fully present because some part of you is always monitoring the device, always aware that something might be happening elsewhere, always half elsewhere. This is not a dramatic condition. Most people who have it do not experience it as a crisis. They experience it as the normal texture of being a person in the 21st century. That normalization is part of what makes it difficult to address. The experience of being fully present, genuinely, undistractedly inside a moment, has become unusual enough that it feels notable when it happens. A conversation where you didn't check your phone, a meal where the table stayed clear of phones, a walk where the phone stayed in the pocket and the mind was allowed to wander without being redirected. These things are not remarkable achievements. They should be unremarkable, the baseline condition of a life. But for a very large number of people, they have become experiences that require deliberate effort, that feel slightly effortful, that are noticed precisely because they are no longer the default. The words for what has been lost and what might be recovered are cognitive sovereignty. It sounds either self-evident or grandiose, depending on where you're standing, but it is trying to name something real. The idea that your mental life, the thoughts you have, the things you attend to, the emotional states you move through, the way you understand yourself is yours, not primarily shaped by systems whose interest is in its exploitation, not rented from the feeds, not calibrated to the approval metrics of a platform. Yours in the sense that it emerges from your actual values and experiences and choices, not from an engineered environment designed to keep you inside it. Most people, if asked, would say they believe their mental life is their own. The evidence suggests that for a significant portion of their waking hours, it isn't. And the gap between what people believe about their inner life and what is actually happening in it is one of the more uncomfortable things this subject requires sitting with. Here is what works at the individual level, not willpower. And this is important to say first, because it's the thing that most people try and most people find inadequate. And this inadequacy feels like personal failure when it is not. Willpower is a finite resource. It depletes with use. And it's being pitted against systems that thousands of engineers, have spent decades refining specifically to overcome it. The asymmetry is real. You are not going to outperform the design through determination. You need to change the environment. The individual practices that work are the ones that change the environment rather than relying on willpower within it. Removing the app and requiring browser access reintroduces friction. Not much friction, but enough to interrupt the automatic, unconsidered reaching. Grayscale mode removes the visual reward that the colour optimised interface provides. The feed becomes significantly less compelling when it's rendered in grey. Turning off all non-essential notifications removes the external trigger. The interruption that arrives from outside rather than being generated by an internal impulse. Keeping the phone out of the bedroom removes it from the one context where the reaching is most automatic and most destructive to sleep. These work not because they require heroic self-discipline, but because they change the conditions in which the behaviour occurs. They make the unconsidered use slightly harder and the considered use slightly more deliberate. That margin of deliberateness is where choice re-enters. The deeper practice, the one that takes longer and matters more, is the rebuilding of the capacity for sustained attention itself. It is, in itself, a physical rehabilitation. A muscle that has been underused needs to be worked carefully and consistently before it recovers its former strength. Reading long-form material, books, essays, anything that requires sustained attention over more than a few minutes is the most direct form of this rehabilitation. Not because reading is inherently superior to other activities, but because it requires, and therefore trains, exactly the capacity that has been degraded. It is resistance exercise for the attention. And what makes this genuinely difficult, not just slightly inconvenient, but genuinely difficult, is that the early stages of rebuilding the attention feel unrewarding in a way that is discouraging. A mind that has been tuned to the rhythm of the feed, where something new arrives every few seconds and every item is short and stimulating, finds the pace of a book chapter slow, finds the paragraph that requires rereading frustrating rather than interesting. The reward of deep reading, the specific satisfaction of having held something complex in mind for long enough to understand it fully, is not immediately available to a mind that has lost the habit. It has to be earned back. And in the period before it is earned back, the easier option is always one pocket away. Return to the train, the boredom that preceded the reinstallation of the app. That boredom is worth dwelling on because it contains more than it appears to. The discomfort of boredom, the restlessness, the sense of unoccupied time pressing on you is not a signal that something is wrong. It is historically the condition that precedes thought. The idle mind is not a wasted mind. It is a mind doing something that the feed never allows, wandering, associating, noticing, occasionally arriving somewhere unexpected. The research on mind wandering suggests that the brain at rest, the brain not focused on any specific task, is doing some of its most important work: creativity, self-reflection, the consolidation of memory, the processing of difficult emotional experience. These are not trivial functions. They are some of the most important things a mind does. The attention economy's deepest intrusion is not that it takes your time, though it does. It's that it colonises the spaces between the moments of waiting, of transit, of lying still, that used to be available to the mind for its own purposes. It's made boredom intolerable by always offering an alternative to it. And in doing so, it's taken something from the inside of a life that is very difficult to name and very real. The boredom on the train was not the problem. The boredom on the train was the beginning of something. Here is the honest part, and it matters that it is honest. Individual practices are real, and they help, and they're not enough. The person who deleted the apps and lasted 11 days was not weak. They were contending alone and with imperfect tools against a structural problem. The asymmetry is not only psychological, it's institutional. The platforms employ thousands of engineers whose work is specifically directed at keeping users in the product. The individual has themselves a grayscale setting, a folder with 3 taps to reach. The adequate response to a structural problem is a structural one. The logic is the same as it was for the tobacco industry and for the fossil fuel industry. And the attention economy deserves to be understood in those terms because the parallel is precise. For decades, tobacco companies sold a product whose costs were borne by users and by the healthcare system, while revenues were private. The regulatory intervention that eventually arrived, restrictions on advertising, mandatory disclosure of harms, prohibitions on marketing to children, did not eliminate the industry, but it substantially removed the harm it could impose. The costs that the industry had been offloading onto everyone else were imperfectly but meaningfully brought back inside. The argument for applying a similar framework to the attention economy is strong. There is already a precedent in financial and medical regulation for the principle that those who manage other people's intimate interests bear a duty toward them. We do not allow financial advisors to recommend products primarily because of the fees they generate. We do not allow doctors to prescribe treatments primarily because of the income they produce. The case for applying the equivalent principle to platforms that process detailed psychological data and use it to manipulate behaviour in service of advertising revenue, for imposing, in short, a duty of care, is not complicated. The absence of such regulation reflects the political power of the industry, not the weakness of the argument. Regulation of this kind will not arrive quickly, and it will be imperfect when it does. But the direction of travel, especially in Europe, but increasingly elsewhere, suggests that the period of entirely unconstrained extraction is ending. The question is how much has been taken in the meantime, and whether what was taken can be recovered. Which brings us to the question that policy cannot reach. Not the system level question of how the attention economy should be regulated. Not even the individual question of which specific practices help most. The deeper question, the one the woman on the train was bumping against when she noticed that the boredom was preferable to the feed, and she reinstalled the app. The question of what kind of relationship with your own mind you are trying to build. This is not a self-help question. It is a philosophical one, and it deserves to be treated as such. Over the past 15 years, the attention economy has established a particular relationship between millions of people and their own inner lives. A relationship in which the inner life is frequently outsourced to the feed, in which boredom is immediately medicated, in which the self is understood partly through the metrics of how it performs for an audience, in which the capacity for genuine solitude, for being alone with your own thoughts without the phone, has quietly atrophied. What it means to reverse this, to build or rebuild a relationship with your own mind that is not primarily mediated by systems whose interest is in its exploitation. It's not a question with a clean answer. It requires the individual practices. It requires the environmental redesign, the slow rehabilitation of the attention. But it also requires something more fundamental, a decision about what your inner life is for. Not what it produces, not how it performs, what it is for. The mind can sit with a difficult paragraph until it opens up. The mind that can be on a train for 2 hours without reaching for the phone and find in that time something worth finding. The mind that can be present in a conversation genuinely there without the background monitoring of the device as an alternative. These are not aspirational states for a certain kind of serious person. They are the basic conditions of a life that is actually being lived rather than continuously half attended to. The attention economy does not want you to have that. Not because it's malicious. We established in the previous video that malice is not the right frame, but because a mind that is fully present, fully occupied by its own experience, fully engaged with the thing in front of it, is a mind that is not in the feed. And a mind that is not in the feed is not generating revenue. The product that the attention economy sells is not content. It is the time you spend half present. Your distraction is their inventory. The most valuable thing you possess is not in your wallet or your portfolio or your reputation. It is the quality of your own attention, the capacity to bring your mind fully to bear on the world, on the people you love, on the work that matters to you, on the simple fact of being alive in a moment that will not come again. That capacity was not given to the platforms. It was taken incrementally in 12-minute intervals before your alarm went off, in the restless scroll through nothing in particular, in the 11 days that became 10 and then 1 and then 0. It was taken without asking, in a transaction that was dressed as a convenience. The question now is not whether you were targeted, because you were. The question is what you decide to do about it. Not as an act of heroic self-discipline, but as a considered choice about what your inner life is actually worth. The paragraph is still there, the one you've tried to read 3 times. It's waiting for a mind that can hold it. That mind is also still there. It just needs the space to be brought back.